My own brother and sister stood there in the living room, calmly folding their clothes and packing their bags, while our mother sat in the corner of her bedroom, staring blankly at a wall because they had just signed the papers to dump her in a state-run nursing home that everyone knew was essentially a waiting room for death. I stood in the doorway, my heart hammering against my ribs, watching them treat the woman who raised us, who sacrificed everything for our comfort, like a piece of inconvenient furniture that they were finally getting rid of to save themselves a few hours of effort each week. They had the audacity to call it the responsible choice, while they discussed splitting the profit from the sale of her house, completely indifferent to the fact that they were betraying the very foundation of our family. I want you to tell me honestly after you hear what I did next if you think I was wrong to burn their perfect little plan to the ground, or if you would have done the exact same thing to protect the only person who ever truly loved us. Everything started, as these things often do, with a quiet decay that none of us wanted to acknowledge until it was screaming for attention. Our mother had been the backbone of our lives, the woman who worked 3 jobs to put my brother Mark and my sister Sarah through private school while she wore the same shoes for 5 years. I was the youngest, the one who stayed close, and as her health began to decline, I saw the slow erosion of her autonomy while my siblings stayed conveniently busy with their careers in different states. I was the one taking her to doctor appointments, managing her medication, and listening to her quiet fears about not wanting to be a burden. I kept Mark and Sarah updated constantly, hoping they would step up, but they always had excuses: a project, a trip, a sudden stress-induced migraine. They started showing up less and less, treating our childhood home like a pit stop rather than the place where they were raised. Then came the diagnosis: a slow-moving neurological decline that required more patience and time than I could provide alone while trying to maintain my own career. I begged them for help, asking them to rotate shifts or just come by on weekends, but they became defensive, claiming they had lives to lead and that I was too attached to the situation. The resentment grew like a weed in the garden of our family, with me doing the heavy lifting while they slowly convinced themselves that Mom wasn't really that bad off, or if she was, it was my responsibility because I lived closer. The tension finally snapped the day they showed up with an attorney and a brochure for a facility 3 hours away, one that had been embroiled in neglect lawsuits for years. They didn't even ask her what she wanted. They just sat her down and told her it was time for her to be taken care of by professionals, while they started measuring the living room for how much they could get for the antiques she spent decades curating. They didn't see a mother. They saw a burden and a financial transaction, and as they laughed about how much their inheritance would increase once the monthly care costs were consolidated, I realized that the people I called siblings were dead inside. I remember watching them walk through the kitchen, criticizing the paint job and suggesting that if they tore down the wall between the dining room and the living area, the property value would skyrocket. They were already spending money that hadn't even been generated yet, listing off luxury cruises and high-end tech upgrades as if they were buying them with their own hard-earned cash. It was sickening. Mom was sitting in her favorite armchair, the one with the frayed velvet cushion, her eyes tracking them with a kind of profound, quiet sorrow that I suspect they were too self-absorbed to even notice. I walked over to her and squeezed her hand, feeling the fragility of her bones and the coldness of her skin, and in that moment something shifted inside me. I had spent years trying to maintain the fragile illusion of a happy, cohesive family for her sake, but as I looked at Mark's smug, well-groomed face and Sarah's impatient tapping of her phone, I knew the illusion had to be shattered. They were treating her life like a clearance sale, and the rage I felt was so cold and precise that I barely recognized myself. I went to the kitchen and made them coffee, playing the role of the subservient younger sibling who had finally accepted the inevitable, pouring their cups with a steady hand while my mind was racing through every single legal vulnerability I could exploit. I listened as they debated which of them would get the original grandfather clock, a piece that had belonged to our grandfather and held immense sentimental value. They didn't care about the history, they just cared about the resale price. I nodded along, offering a tight, empty smile, and made sure to keep my voice soft and agreeable. I had to keep them comfortable, keep them convinced that I was defeated because that was the only way they would get sloppy. And they did get sloppy. They spent the next 2 hours bragging about how they had managed to convince Mom that this was for her own good, laughing about how easy it was to manipulate her when she was tired. Every word they spoke was just more evidence for the pile I was secretly building. I wasn't just observing them. I was cataloging their cruelty, preparing for the moment I would finally stop playing the victim and start being the architect of their downfall. I knew that if I waited for the legal process to move on its own, it would be too late. I had to control the narrative, own the evidence, and move faster than they ever could. I started by suggesting that they handle the probate paperwork themselves to save on legal fees, knowing full well that in their haste, they would attempt to file documents that were fundamentally flawed or outright dishonest. I even volunteered to help them organize the financial records, helping them categorize the assets in a way that would make it blindingly obvious to any forensic accountant that they were attempting to siphon money away from the primary care fund. It was a long, exhausting game of chess, but every piece I moved was designed to trap them in their own arrogance. I kept a journal writing down everything they said, every time they dismissed Mom's needs for their own convenience, and every single lie they told the facility representatives. I was becoming as cold as they were, but for a different reason, not for profit but for justice. I spent the next few days in a fog of rage and clarity, knowing I had to act because once she was in that place, she would be isolated and silenced. I had always been the quiet one, the one who kept the peace, but that part of me died the moment I saw the look of terror in my mother's eyes when she realized her own children were abandoning her. I started looking through her old files, the ones she kept hidden in the back of the mahogany desk, and I found the original trust documents from when our father passed away. It turned out that the house, the savings, and even the family business shares were not actually hers to give away in the way Mark and Sarah thought. Everything was held in a specific arrangement that required the consent of all 3 children for any liquidation of assets. They didn't know this because they hadn't bothered to read the fine print in a decade, assuming they could just steamroll over me and take whatever they wanted. I realized that if I played this right, I could trap them in their own greed, using their hunger for money to force them to acknowledge their responsibilities. I needed to let them think they were winning while I set the stage for a reveal that would make them wish they had never stepped foot in that house again. I had to be cold, calculated, and absolutely relentless just like they were. I started by playing the part of the submissive, hurt younger sibling who had finally given up. I told them I was tired of fighting, that they were right, and that I would help them prepare the house for sale. Their faces lit up with such vile relief that it made my skin crawl. They started planning their vacations, talking about new cars and renovations, completely ignoring the fact that their mother was sitting in the next room, listening to every word. I became their assistant in their own downfall, helping them inventory everything while secretly documenting their negligence, recording their conversations about how they didn't want to visit her, and waiting for the moment they would finally commit the final irreversible act of betrayal. I want you to really think about this for a moment. I was essentially gaslighting them into believing they had absolute power, all while preparing to take it all away. If you were in my position, watching your own flesh and blood prioritize money over the life of your mother, would you have tried to talk sense into them, or would you have done what I did and set a trap to make them pay for their cold-heartedness? Take a second, pause this video, and drop a comment below telling me exactly how you would have handled these 2 vultures. When the day of the move finally arrived, they came with a moving truck and a sense of entitlement that was suffocating. They told Mom it was just a short trip to a resort, and had her packed and ready before she even understood what was happening. As they loaded her boxes, mostly things she didn't even want to take, I pulled the attorney they had hired aside. I hadn't told him the full truth yet, but I had gathered enough evidence of their intent to neglect and their attempt to illegally distribute assets that he was looking very nervous. As Mark and Sarah stood in the driveway, bragging about how much they were going to get for the house in the current market, I walked over to them with the original trust documents and a copy of the recorded conversations I had been collecting for weeks. I didn't yell. I didn't scream. I just handed them the papers and told them that if they took one more step toward the nursing home, I would release the recordings to the local authorities and file a formal legal injunction that would freeze all of their personal assets for the duration of a multi-year audit. The look on their faces was the most satisfying thing I have ever witnessed. Their arrogance evaporated, replaced by a pale, shaking realization that they hadn't just failed to get what they wanted. They were now facing severe legal repercussions for elder abuse and fraud. I informed them that they were now going to sign a document that gave me full irrevocable power of attorney over Mom's health and finances, and that they would have to fund a legitimate, high-end in-home care arrangement for her, or I would see to it that they lost everything they had worked for in their own careers. They tried to threaten me, they tried to claim I was blackmailing them, but I reminded them that in the court of law, Audio evidence of them discussing the disposal of a parent doesn't look very good to a judge. They were trapped, caught in the web of their own avarice, and they knew it. The climax wasn't a physical fight. It was the total dismantling of their power. They had to call off the move. They had to pay for a private nurse who would stay with Mom in the comfort of her own home. And they were forced to forfeit their claim to the proceeds of the house until long after she passed away. The aftermath was silence. They didn't talk to me for months, but they paid every single bill for her care. And they made sure that if they couldn't have the inheritance, they at least didn't end up in jail for elder abuse. Mom lived out her remaining years in the room where she felt most safe, surrounded by her own things, and I was there every day to make sure she was loved. The karma was quiet, but it was absolute. They had to watch as their own greed cost them their reputation, their control, and the respect of the only family member who had actually stayed by their side. They didn't learn their lesson out of kindness but out of fear, and in the end that was enough. It was a long journey, and there were nights I spent crying in the hallway, wondering if I had gone too far. But then I would walk into her room, see her sleeping peacefully in her own bed, and know that the cost was worth it. They thought they could discard her like yesterday's news, but they learned the hard way that when you push someone to the brink of losing the only thing they care about, you create a force that can burn everything you thought was untouchable. They learned that blood may be thicker than water, but greed makes the bond brittle enough to shatter. They had to pay for their mistakes every single month, watching the money they craved go toward the comfort of the person they wanted to throw away, and in that realization, they were forced to live in the shadow of their own failure for the rest of their lives. Looking back on this, I realize that some people will never change, and sometimes you have to be the villain in their story to protect the heroes in yours. My mother deserved peace, not a cold bed in a facility run by people who didn't know her name, and I am proud that I fought for her when no one else would. Life is too short to let people mistreat those who raised them just because they think they can get away with it. If you believe I did the right thing by standing up to my siblings and ensuring my mother's dignity, please hit that like button to show your support, and subscribe to the channel so we can keep sharing these stories that need to be heard. I want to know what you think. Would you have let them take her, or would you have fought back just as hard? Leave your final thoughts in the comments section below, and I'll see you all in the next story.